Male Achievement Network for their help and technical support with this webinar. Today's event is dedicated in the memory of NFLG member Peter Spokes of the National Center on Fathering, where he served as President and Chief Operating Officer until he passed away in May of 2010. Peter was the ultimate team player, exuding competence and compassion for all fathers and families. NFLG is a coalition of national and community-based fatherhood organizations, individual fatherhood practitioners, and others interested in fatherhood and family strengthening. NFLG is a 501c3 organization, and we encourage you to visit our website at nflgonline.org. That's nflgonline.org to learn more about us and how you can become a member. Our mission is to provide collaborative leadership to support individuals and organizations working to build and sustain the fatherhood field and to raise the awareness of the importance of fathers in the lives of children and families. After 20 years of growth and development, the responsible fatherhood field is at a crossroad. This crossroad is characterized by the failure of national policy and community systems of service to fully embrace fathers as assets to their children, families, and community. Particularly for low-income African-American fathers, existing policies and practice have fallen short because of the complex dynamics of their lives have not always been adequately understood. However, new research shows an immediate opportunity for positive and enduring impact by tapping into the care, hopes, and dreams of fathers that fathers have for their children, their families, and themselves. Our featured speaker and expert respondent panel will discuss this research and other cutting-edge strategies for addressing long-standing challenges facing the responsible fatherhood field. So let's get to it. I'm pleased to introduce our featured presenter, my friend, colleague, and mentor, Dr. Kathryn Edin. Kathy is Professor of Public Policy and Management at the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy at Harvard University. She is the author of more than 50 journal articles and 6 books. Kathy joins us today to discuss observations detailed in her most recent book, Doing the Best I Can, Fathering in the Inner City, written with Timothy Nelson. Kathy, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe. It's great to be here. I think I'll dive right in. I want to talk about the diverging destinies in America of men. Often we talk about the diverging destinies of children by social class, and there's been a lot of attention to that. But behind those children are their parents, including the men. And increasingly in the United States, men's destinies are diverging based on their socioeconomic status. And so for a shorthand of that, I'm going to talk a little bit about education and give you some statistics that present a backdrop of the story that we tell in Doing the Best I Can. So what I'm going to look at here are data coming from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, 1997 cohort. This is a panel study of the young men who have now reached the age of 27 to 30. So these are really men in their prime family building years. And what we see is that men with less than a high school education, about 2/3 have become fathers by age 26 to 30, as opposed to only about 10% of men with a BA. And furthermore, those 2/3 usually have more than one child. This puts them at much greater risk of what we call multiple partner fertility, which I'm going to feature in my remarks today. So for those with more than 2 children, you have to have more than 2 children to have multiple partner fertility. Almost half of men without a high school degree with 2 children have those children with more than one partner. Again, for their college-educated counterparts, the figure is 5.1%. So one more statistic I want to leave you with to orient our discussion, and that is fathers' residence with their biological children. If you look at men, fathers with less than a high school education, more than 2/3 have ever lived away from at least one of their biological kids, versus only about 10% of fathers with a BA. So what we see here is that less educated men, men with lower socioeconomic status, are far more likely than their college-educated counterparts to become fathers in their mid-20s, have more than one child by that time, have a child by more than one partner, and again, this is especially salient, and finally, ever live apart from a biological child. So we're really talking about less educated men here. Minority men, of course, are overrepresented, but the rate of growth among white men and Latino men is striking, whereas rates for African American men have leveled off somewhat. So the question I want to ask is, how successful are these men at managing the complex families that they often find themselves in? Now, the stats tell us, I think, a two-sided story. So if you look at all fathers in complex families, that is, that have their children by more than one partner, and you look at their maximum involvement, in other words, the child they are most involved with, we say that over 85% are intensively involved with at least one of their biological children, visiting several times weekly or even daily, and really giving their all to the task of fathering. But those same men, when we look at the child they're least involved with, show a very different picture. Almost half of those men are either disengaged completely or almost completely with another of their biological children. And these are young men, so they're not men in their 40s or 50s who might have grown apart from their children. These are really men in the prime family building years. So what we have here is evidence that fathers in complex families are really struggling with the task of managing complex family ties. They're committed to fathering on one hand, and they seem to be doing so fairly well. But nearly half are leaving at least one of their biological children behind while fathering another. And this is the pattern of fathering that we document in Doing the Best I Can, what we call serial selective fathering. And the book Tim Nelson and I wrote tells the story of how men end up fathering in this way through their own words, even though they don't intend to do so. Now, ethnographers like to tell stories, so let me tell you one story, and that is of David. And David's situation, which we're going to talk about several points in the next few minutes, I think gives an illustration of what serial selective fatherhood looks like. David, a year ago, with his partner Deborah, gave birth to a beautiful baby boy named Julian. David said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, seeing that baby come out of his mother's womb, spinning like a bullet. He's very involved with Deborah's two children by a prior partner as well, and he's devoting all of his resources from his day labor job and his second job. He moonlights selling newspapers at the base of the Ben Franklin Bridge to sustain this new family. So on the one hand, David might look very successful as a father, and he feels that he's fathering well. But David has two sons he hasn't seen in over a year. The mother became jealous when he and Deborah had Julian, and at least David's side of the story is that she moved, leaving no forwarding address. And he has very little contact with his 17 and 8-year-old daughter, sees him only once a month or on holidays, and offers no financial support for their care. He was separated from these girls when they were fairly young because of a spell of incarceration. And it turns out that David's situation, very disengaged with some of his children and very engaged with others, is fairly typical. So I would argue that this is not an ideal scenario for either the men or especially the children. The question is, what can we do about it? And what I'm going to end with is the statement that we suffer from a failure of imagination. We need to push harder, get new ideas, go farther, because it is in the critical interest of men, children, women, and communities that we do so. So what potential points of intervention does Doing the Best I Can reveal? First of all, we've spent a lot of time in the book describing the process of relationship formation, and this is a story that's been neglected in fatherhood research more generally. We argue that in some ways, the process by which two young people come together and have a baby is in some sense the whole story behind breakup and paternal disengagement. And if we can interrupt the typical process of relationship formation and intervene, we might be able to do a whole lot of good in ways we haven't really thought very much about before. Now I'm going to bring the voices of the fathers in here. First of all, we're going to hear from Amin Jenkins from Strawberry Mansion, a neighborhood in Philadelphia. He says, in describing the process of relationship formation with his son's mother, Well, my son's mother, I met her at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. She was attracted to me when I first saw her, and I made my approach. We began to socialize and communicate, and then from there we began to affiliate. And at some point in time, we became intimate, and my son was born. So what's striking about these quotes is about what isn't in them as well as what is. And what you note about a means language is that it's highly bureaucratic, and it doesn't really specify whether he and his son's mother are together in a real relationship or not. Notably, the words love and commitment are absent from this story of relationship formation. Now let's go to John Carr in Kensington. He says, actually, she was dating a friend of mine, and somehow she wanted me, but it was my friend's girl, so I didn't want to have nothing to do with it. But then my friend heard some shit and started talking shit and saying he would kick my ass. So eventually I was like, whatever, then I will be with your girl. Eventually, I just got stuck with her for a while. So again, what's notable about John's quote is what isn't there as well as what is. This woman went on several months later to have his first child in the Cape May Regional Medical Center in South Jersey. Tim O'Brien from Fishtown says, I was hanging at a friend of mine's house, and her and a couple of her friends were there, and she used to go out with my friend. My friend was trying to get back with her, and I ended up getting with her. We were only together for about 2 months, and she was getting pregnant. I didn't mind at all. Will Donnelly from Fairview says, I had just come out of a juvenile institution. I think I had just turned 17, and I started going with her friend. And then one day she came around and we started talking. And I went with her and left her friend, and me and her got together and started having kids together. And then we got closer and closer. Then we started living together. So Will's quote is especially salient because of the order of relationship events it reveals. First, you get together and start having kids. Then you get closer and closer. Then you start living together. And I'll bring up the salience of these quotes in a minute. But one more quote, and this is from David Williams, whose story we talked about earlier. This is from when the part of the narrative when David did not have his little baby Julian yet, but was just sort of kicking it with Deborah. And he says, when I was first with Deborah, I had a girlfriend on the side too, Kathy. She was someone I met at a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. We got close and we were helping each other with our addictions. One thing led to another and we got intimate. Me and Deborah would get into an argument. She'd tell me to leave. I'd go stay with Kathy. So at this point we ask, so how did you end it with Kathy? And David says, Deborah got pregnant and I had to do what was right. Stand by Deborah, okay? But after David hears the news of the pregnancy, he says, each month of the pregnancy we got closer and closer. I wanted to be with her more. And then like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, she had me running to Pathmark, it's a grocery store in Philly, buying different foods. So that brought us closer too. And then watching him born brought us even closer. On her last push, he came out spinning like a bullet. Nothing was more beautiful than Julian. The way he came out of his mother, that was amazing. And I held him. And I didn't want to let him go. Okay, let's mine these quotes a little bit for themes. That's what I do. It's my business, so to speak. First of all, for the modal guy in our study, and we hung out with 110 black and white guys in Philadelphia over an 8-year period. Courtship, if you could even call it that, is very, very short, even just a 1 night or 2 months' time. And men are employing little selectivity in who becomes the child's mother. The phrase, one thing leads to another, comes up over and over again, describing a very path-dependent relationship that involves little planning. When you ask men to describe the conception of their children, they typically say, well, it wasn't planned, it wasn't exactly an accident, I just wasn't thinking at the time. Most men will say they were together with their girlfriends, but they weren't in a real relationship either. And as was the case with the men whose quotes I read you, it is pregnancy that prompts the real relationship. Pregnancy is a desperate scramble to get it together for the baby, the it being the relationship between the parents. If you know the Fragile Families and Child Well-Being Study, you know that 80% of the time, fathers in large cities who are interviewed say they're together with the mother at the time of the birth, and the mothers agree. But these are largely shotgun relationships, sort of forged in an effort to form a family around an unplanned pregnancy. Now, the crucial thing to know about these relationships is especially from the father's point of view, they're all about the baby. The way men see the family is with the child-father bond at the center and the mother-father bond at the periphery. This is very different from sort of the Ward Cleaver image of the family that was popular many years ago, and that is still holds a lot of salience among middle-class men. And we argue that it is this vision of family where it's all about the father-child tie that creates an underinvestment by men in the couple relationship. In fact, men often tell themselves a key lie, and you hear this over and over again in the interviews. My relationship with my child has nothing to do with the mother. But as we know, as those of us who have served and talked with these guys, it is everything to do with the mother. And once the breakup occurs, as it most often does, it's trouble for the dad. Now, dads become separated from their kids through gatekeeping, and I think all of us who call ourselves feminists have to come to grips with the problem that maternal gatekeeping is real. Ron Mincy and Laura Tuck and I have done some work on this topic, showing that it's incredibly salient. Father's own circumstances and failures get in the way, but that early pregnancy seems to stoke a strong father thirst, and men engage on a quest to get the whole father experience. They not only want to see their children once a month, they don't just want to pay child support, they want to change diapers, they want to be there for the first words, the first steps. It becomes a very intense part of young men's identity to father and be generative for the next generation, just as it is for young women. So when a father gets separated from one of his children for any reason, gatekeeping, his own failures, a prison sentence, a mother moving away with no forwarding address, he often allows one thing to lead to another yet again. He has another unplanned pregnancy with another partner in an effort to claim the whole fatherhood experience. Suddenly, this dad is in a complex family, and then things get very, very hard because in complex families, one child's interests often get pitted against those of the others. So we talked about the process of relationship formation as being a potential point of intervention. The second is to interrupt that family go-around fathers so often find themselves on in search of this whole fatherhood experience early by ensuring that we satisfy the father thirst with that first child. So let me give you the father's voices again to give you a little bit of a sense of how strong this father thirst is. We asked each guy, how did you respond to the news that you were about to become a father? Daryl says, I lit up. Stan says, I wanted a kid really bad. Paul says, you know I'm getting ready to go to prison, and it's really your choice, but I want you to have the baby because I don't have any kids and I want a child. Amin says, even though I was not in love, I wanted a son. Stephen says, I was glad. It was no major obstacle. Those were some of our African American fathers. Our white fathers gave similar responses. Giovanni is especially illustrative. He says, I thought, oh, sweetie, I'm going to be a daddy. That was my feeling. If I could have bottled it and kept it, I would have. So more evidence for how meaningful children are to these men comes from a second question we asked each father. What would your life be like if you never had your child? And listen to the voices of some of our African American fathers. Kevin says, I'd probably be in jail. Q says, I'd be dead because of the simple fact that it wasn't until Brianna was born that I started to chill out. Mike says, I'd probably be dead somewhere back in jail, in and out of rehabs. Children have given me something to fight for, something like a destination. I've got to be somewhere. 7 says, I couldn't imagine being without them because when I'm spending time with my kids, it is like, now that's love. That's unconditional love. It's like a drug you've got to have. Bill says, I'd still be out there. I'd still be doing drugs and all, but I think about my kids, and there's just this hope I have now of getting a good relationship with them. So the bottom line is that doing the best I can shows that many fathers end up satisfying the father thirst and finding meaning in fatherhood in a highly imperfect way, one that is far from ideal for them and especially for their kids. So what can we do? Again, I return to these two themes. First, we have to think of creative ways to disrupt the haphazard process of relationship formation. We have a national campaign to prevent early and unplanned childbearing for women. Perhaps we need one for men. Here are some messages I think could work. Slow down. Select your child's mother. Wait till you are ready to have a child. Another message could be, you can't ignore your relationship with the mother of your child and get fatherhood a la carte. It's a package. A third message might be, keep it simple. Being a good father when your kids have more than one mother is really hard. But ultimately, fathers' willingness to let one thing lead to another and have an accidental pregnancy and birth is because of the void and meaning in their lives, and we have to address that as well. Second, we've got to disrupt the family go-round that new fathers often find themselves over time. We have to keep that dad engaged with their first child. So that would involve addressing and taking seriously the issues of maternal gatekeeping. Mom needs to get the message that she can't replace dad with a new partner, as she sometimes does, and Laura Tack and Ron Mincy and I have found evidence of that. Second, we've got to insist on responsible behavior, but we have to pair this with an emphasis on respect. We need to honor these men's value as parents, not just as paychecks. Now, fatherhood programs are already doing this, but they can't do it alone. We need clear societal, i.e. policy signals, that these men have valuable contributions to make as parents, as workers, and as members of our communities, and frankly, as human beings. We also need to give poor and minority dads the same de facto rights that middle-class and white dads now have. I live near D.C. for the year. I'm on sabbatical from Harvard and living in Baltimore, where Joe's shop is located. And I have to laugh every time I drive into the district and see the license plates. But this is kind of also an issue of taxation without representation. The child support order should be paired with child shared custody agreements or visitation rights in a way that the Minnesota Family Court is experimenting with. And finally, we've got to integrate fathers into all of our social institutions and make those institutions not just about moms, but truly gender neutral. Family should not mean mother and child. Dad should be expected at the OBGYN, the pediatrician, the Head Start Center, the Parent-Teacher Conference, and so on. So I'm going to just end with one final remark. We've got Ron Haskins on the phone, who was arguably the architect or at least the implementer of welfare reform. And most economists who have looked at welfare reform argue that it worked, not just because of the sticks, but because of the very large carrots we added at the same time. This very generous system of tax credits for low-wage working moms, which gave them a big pay raise. So the bottom line is that the desired behavior, which for that reform was work, suddenly had a clear reward. Now, if you look at responsible fatherhood, our policy has been almost entirely focused on sticks. And I believe these sticks are unlikely to take us much further in solving the problems I just outlined. Tim Nelson and I argue in the book that it's time for some carrots. And the main carrot that the men desire is to ensure they can be more deeply involved with their kids' lives. So can we link responsible behavior with a clear reward? Can we grant better access? Can we provide wage subsidies like they're experimenting with in New York? What about jobs of last resort? And we need even more innovative ideas. Most of you know I teach at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and we bring in wonderful, innovative young people from around the world who want to solve the vital social problems of their time. Sometimes when they look at the evidence about what we've tried so far, they conclude that nothing works. And what I say to them is that we've only just gotten started. We've only really tried just a few things. So don't wring your hands. Go out there and innovate. And I'd offer that same message to the audience. Thank you.
Wow, Kathy, on behalf of the audience and, folks who will ultimately access your presentation from the NFLG website at nflgonline.org. In the words of Muhammad Ali, you are shaking up the world with your latest book and the ethnographic way in which you approach distilling the stories of the lives of these men across ethnic lines. It's not a black issue, it's not a white issue, it's an American issue. With that, let me transition to the next segment of our webinar today and introduce my friend, colleague, and longtime practitioner who happens to also be a lawyer, Kirk Harris. Dr. Harris is co-designer and senior advisor to the Fathers and Families Healthy Communities Demonstration, a citywide initiative in Chicago, and he's a faculty member in the Department of Urban Planning, School of Agriculture and Urban Planning at the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. Greetings, Kurt.
Thank you, Brother Joe. I appreciate it, and thank you to Kathy for her insightful and penetrating look into the lives of urban fathers. And this work is so important, and I thank her for advancing these ideas. I will take this segment to introduce a very distinguished set of panelists who will spend about 5 minutes responding to Kathy's presentation, and then we have some really pointed questions that we'd like those panelists to consider. And with that, let me just go through quickly the introductions. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Vivian Gadsden, who is the William T. Carter Professor of Child Development and Education, and also the Director of the National Center on Fathers and Families at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Gadsden is a responsible fatherhood research pioneer, having carried out seminal work by developing the 7 core learnings that established the first comprehensive evidence-based framework for responsible fatherhood practice, policy, and research development. Our second panelist will be Dr. Ron Haskins, who's the co-director, Center on Children and Families, Budgeting for National Priorities, and senior fellow with the Economic Studies at Brookings Institute. Dr. Haskins is a former White House and congressional advisor on welfare issues. Dr. Haskins was instrumental in the 1996 overhaul of the national welfare policy, and Dr. Haskins is a highly respected policy expert who is deeply interested in fatherhood and family strengthening issues. And last, but certainly by no means least, we have Dr. Ronald Mincy, who is the Morris V. Russell Professor of Social Policy and Social Work Practice and Director of the Center for Research on Fathers, Children, and Family Well-Being at Columbia University, often affectionately referred to those of us who are in the responsible fatherhood field as the godfather of responsible fatherhood, as a result of his enormous contribution to the field as a funder and a researcher, and as a result of his leadership as the chief architect of the Fragile Family Demonstration that significantly advanced practice, public policy, and research in support of low-income fathers and their families. And with that, Dr. Gadsden, might you start us off?
Okay. Thank you so much, Kirk and Joe, as well as all of the members of NFLG for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you as well, Kathy, for this wonderful book that you co-authored with Tim. The two of you bring a deep understanding of the often conflicting and contradictory narratives that exist in our field. We also bring a deep understanding of the plight of the men whom you study. So I'm going to just go through about 5 broad themes that I would like us to be able to discuss during this webinar. One of the themes that was really clear in this book was the idea of looking at fathers' experiences, their identities, and the barriers to what I would call a fathering identity. Embedded in that is what I consider a search for meaning. And Kathy and Tim suggest that issues around fathers are experienced and responded to differently by virtue of a father's age, his culture, his ethnicity, gender, masculinity, masculine identity, race, and class, and particularly what he believes being a man entails. For these fathers, we know that economic and social factors such as loss of jobs and increasing rates of incarceration have created chronic poverty. They have undermined the instrumental roles of economic provider that fathers play in supporting their children and families. And they've contributed to a kind of vulnerability that I don't think personally or professionally we are able to reconcile. Within that theme as well, though, is this idea that Kathy highlighted, which is children as saviors, that marriage and marriage formation, relationship formation appear to be secondary to the presence of children. And then within all of that lies this question of the level of agency that the young fathers, or the fathers, not all young, felt that they had. Noting, for instance, the idea that one thing leads to another, reminding us that age does not ensure maturity, nor does becoming a father ensure adulthood. And so we have to really kind of work with the young men at the places where they find themselves. A strength of this book, among many others, is the fact that the authors do not over-rely on comparative data. And I was really pleased when Kathy said that we're not going to look at them, that in fact these fathers do not have some of the affordances that middle-class fathers have. However, there's a question of how much of these practices and behaviors do exist across different ethnic groups and social classes. So in this regard, I think more deepened ethnographic work, as well as stronger quantitative and other empirical work, which includes multiple methods, would be a particularly useful thing for us to think, for those of us who do research, as well as for those of us who want to support practice in the most meaningful ways. Thinking about as well how families, communities, and neighborhoods contribute to the men's sense of being. A second area really has to do with the culture context and relationship context. This ethnography is able to capture the multiple ways that culture is enacted. It speaks to questions of visibility and invisibility of the men, the facelessness in some cases of these men in their communities. The response that I would like to address is the ways in which the research informs us about how fathers use and make sense of the different contexts in which they find themselves. What cultural and social practices are they taking with them, which would be social practices in which they believe, and what are the intersections between and among what our expectations are, who are not the fathers, and the ones that they carry with them over a lifetime. And lastly, in the spirit of trying to hold to my 5 minutes, I want to just kind of speak very briefly to the question of poverty, joblessness, job retention, and education. What was striking to me as a person in the School of Education, of course, is the fact that so many of these fathers had dropped out of school for reasons that some of us may think were small reasons, but for them, reasons that seem to be important. And what it does suggest that there needs to be more alignment between and among different systems, both of fathers and their children and families. Municipal databases, we have one here in Philadelphia, the Kids Integrated Database, that bring together information about, from different sources about children, and we might use the same kind of ecological approach to thinking about fathers as well. There are kind of 3 other points I just want to say very briefly. The role of fathering programs and the role that they can play should be revisited. The ways in which communication and love are both discussed by these men broadly. The ongoing review and revision of federal policy and the complement of local and state efforts, jobs, education, and social programs, and really kind of reconciling and examining, interrogating more directly the issues related to marriage and relationship formation. I think these are really important issues that speak to the ways in which we we actually embrace rather than dismiss the lives of these fathers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gadsden. And Dr. Haskins, I would love you to bring your message.
Yes, thank you very much. I love the book, of course, and Kathy's to be complimented for this book, just like all her other books. They certainly bring the real world into the scholarly community, which is not always very easy to do. I just want to make one point and follow it up a little bit, and that is in Kathy's quote of many of the fathers saying to her, it has nothing to do with the mother. And I think eventually she came back to the point and said, actually, it has everything to do with the mother, and that's the perspective that I want to urge that fathers themselves and the fathers group adopt. Let me say first that from several people have mentioned the fragile family study. We know from the fragile family studies that about half of the couples that have a non-marital birth are living together at the time of the birth. That number may have gone down a little bit. In addition to that 50%, another approximately 30% say they're in love. Either the mother or the father say they're in love. Keep in mind these are the unmarried couples that Kathy is writing about. So that's about 80%. Now I do not suffer from the belief that these are 80% of really wonderful, tight relationships with all kinds of problems worked out and so forth. But at least I think the message here, it gives us something to work with. There's at least a spark, there's something that was between these two adults, and I think that is what we really should focus on. I want to mention that under the Bush administration we had a number of initiatives to try to encourage marriage, one of which was called Building Strong Families, and there were 8 sites in the country. In 6 sites there was hardly any impact, but one of the sites had a very substantial impact. It was a site in Oklahoma, and they took these young couples and really improved their relationship based on the testimony of the couples themselves. Their trust in each other improved, the fidelity of the father and the mother improved. There were several impacts on the relationship measured 15 months after the program began, and although some of those disappeared at a subsequent measurement period, the couples that got the treatment, that participated in the program, were nonetheless 20%, almost 20% more likely still to be together. Now there are all kinds of scientific issues here, but I think it at least should give people the hope. And this is the first time we tried this, as Kathy pointed out. We're just beginning. I think we could adapt programs that could be much more successful, and we could help the mother and the father form their relationship, because this is really the single thing that's the most important. We have tons of research now that shows, especially if the fathers are so committed to the children, the best thing they can do for the children is have a happy and productive relationship with the mother, eventually leading to marriage and a stable home life, and that child will flourish much better under that situation than under any other situation. So my message to fatherhood groups is that this should be the first focus. I know that there are a lot of fathers that are beyond that first relationship. Kathy described many of them, and you have to have something else for them. But focus on that first relationship. Try to help those couples stay together. And if we can do that, it will make a big difference. I want to add one thing to that. I do think that there are some carrots already. There's very careful research that shows, and I would suggest that fatherhood programs and people who want to help these young guys learn this, that the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit taken together, in easily a majority of these cases, the family would actually be better off if they got married and if they filed a joint tax return, because the EITC would go up. That's not always true, but in many cases it is. And the family would probably lose some cash benefit, but very few of them are on cash welfare now. And the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, which are universal, would go up for a large majority of these families. So I think we do have some sticks. The message that it's all about the relationship between the mother and the father, and focusing on trying to help them build their relationship and focusing on the advantages of marriage through the tax code, I think would be a great start for these programs.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Haskins. And Dr. Mincy, leading from the rear, but always having something significant to say. We'd like you to offer your comments and thoughts. Dr. Mincy?
First of all, kudos to Kathy and Tim Nelson for this contribution to a growing literature that's helping to improve our understandings of non-marital children and their parents. I think the things I'd like to focus on is what sort of qualitative studies can't do, and that is, I think one of the biggest contributions of this work is that it's like taking a camera and taking a telephoto lens and really zooming in on the fathers and the nature of their relationships with the mothers of their children and their desires about fathering. And in doing so, I think the readers get a better understanding of who these men are as fathers than from much of the literature that we have. I think the other side of it, though, is to ask sort of how generalizable are these results and how many people are we talking about? And what I'm concerned is that readers may not have an understanding that this is a really large population. The population of non-resident fathers who are economically vulnerable. So there are about 10 million non-resident fathers in the United States, and about 6 million of them make less than $40,000 a year. And if you count what they have to pay in child support plus their regular expenses, after you make those deductions, they are, not far above 3 times the poverty level if they live with a single, if they live in a single-person household. So I think the thing I would like readers of Kathy's book to walk away with is that it could well be the case that most of us in the United States have a mother, a father, a cousin, an uncle who is in the same circumstance that, or very similar circumstance to that which Kathy talks about. Perhaps not all of them have multiple partner fertility yet, but they are in a position where they are not living with their children. Their relationships with the mothers of their children are challenged. They have difficulty gaining access to their children. And if those are the precursors, I think the main thing that comes out of Kathy's book speaks to the issue of what I would call a paternal instinct. They are then at risk of having another child by another partner because they want the full experience of being a father. And so though this is a very important qualitative work because it zeroes in, I think what readers and policymakers need to do as they look at this is to sort of back out that lens and think about how many men are we talking about who are in this vulnerable place, and it would help us just think more carefully about Kathy's final set of questions about what ought we to do. So, and to that question, I think I have sort of 2 responses. One is that we have a set of policies that work with non-resident fathers, but in this administration, the Obama administration has very carefully developed a set of proposals around making sure that non-resident, to equalize the access to children that non-resident fathers has to the situation that comes about for divorced fathers. So I think we really need to be much more aggressive about making sure that legally and otherwise the barriers to gaining access to your children are removed for unmarried fathers, those who cohabit with the mothers of their children near the birth of the child and then break up, as well as those who are simply romantically involved with the mothers of the child and subsequently break up. Because if it's this desire to stay in contact with your children and to complete the process of fathering that places many men at risk of multiple partner fertility, then that's the thing that we have to deal with. And legally, we treat the issue of, public policy is very, very engaged in collecting child support on behalf of children, but public policy to date does very little about giving non-resident fathers access to their children. And from the vantage point of the fathers that we're talking about, that makes no sense. They take the view that if I'm financially responsible for my children, I also need to have an opportunity to continue to develop my relationship with the children. And therefore, the things that the Obama administration is trying to do, making sure that non-resident fathers have parenting plans at the moment they admit paternity and are paying child support, these are policy decisions that we need to sort of follow through on. And I think that's the biggest and most important thing that we can do from a policy standpoint to address the issue that Kathy and Tim's book raised. And I think the final thing that I would say is that the other thing I'm happy about the book is that in the long history of this literature, so much of this conversation has focused on Black and Latino men. And I think it's very, very helpful that that the book visits non-resident fathers who are Black and who are white, so that people get a better understanding of that this issue that we're talking about. 50% of all children in the United States who are born to women under 30 are born to unmarried women. So this is no longer sort of a ghettoized issue that's primarily among people of color. It is quite generic. And if we understand it in that way, I think the seriousness with which we pursue policy solutions would be a lot greater. That's it.
Thank you, Dr. Mincy. So let me just offer this. So we've had some discussion, and Kathy presented with respect to her findings, that these men have something to give. And so how should we define the asset that low-income urban fathers possess, and how can community practice and national public policy cultivate those assets to build better outcomes for children? Can we have the panelists, and I don't have any particular order, but maybe we can start with you, Ron, and then back to Dr. Haskins, and then Dr. Gadsden.
Well, I think one of the things that the fathers have to offer is the nature of their relationship with their children from the children's vantage point. So in communities where, you know, rates of non-marital parenting are very high, you often have what Kathy calls, you know, these complex families in which children are being raised in a household in which their siblings have a father who is different from their own father. And, you know, the children are very aware of that. However, you know, children have physical characteristics. They have ways of doing things. They have personalities and the like. And they often want to know, fill out the information about who they are, what their identity is. And I think one of the challenges that we have for children who grow up without their fathers is they don't have a lot of information about who their fathers are. They can't corroborate why they are tall, why their ears are shaped in the way they are, why they have you know, certain talents. And one of the things that fathers can do for their children is fill out their own sense of identity. And by not being very focused on helping fathers and children, biological parents, connect with one another, we are robbing children of part of their identity. And so I think we don't have to go very far to think about the assets that fathers can present for children simply by helping them understand who they are and giving them a sense of their biological history, their family background. That's information that fathers carry with them, and that's information that as a society we have really denied these children by being ruthlessly clear about collecting child support and very equivocal about connecting kids and fathers.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Dr. Haskins, thoughts?
I would, if I were going to organize a course to try to help these young men with their children, I would emphasize 4 things. And I think all 4 of these things, if you read Kathy's book, they come through that the fathers do these things, it seems like, based on her narrative already. And if we could help them do them better and more often, I think it would be a great achievement. The first thing is set expectations. I think the father ought to communicate to the child that he expects him to behave, of course, but also about his schoolwork, attendance at school, you know, the basic ideas about how you get ahead in American society, and that the father expects and is confident that the child will do that. Second thing is warmth. One of the surprising things about Kathy's book is I think a lot of people would think that these guys, many of whom are somewhat violent and often get arrested and have jail records and so forth, that they may have some trouble with warmth. But apparently they do not. So they ought to be reinforced for that. They ought to be told that this is a very important part of parenting, is expressing warmth to the child, both physically and through what the adult says to the child. The third thing is talk. And I think this is an area especially where we could tell the fathers, you cannot talk too much to your child. Starting when the child is a baby, talk to the child incessantly, ask the child questions, get the child to respond, listen to the child, have back and forth conversations. This is one of the most distinguishing characteristics of parents who have children who do well during the preschool years. They talk a lot to their children, they ask them lots of questions, and they listen to them. And then the final thing is punishment. We have a ton of studies that show that corporal punishment, physical punishment, is deleterious to a kid's development. So fathers should be cautioned about it. They should set expectations, they should have rules, and they should have punishments. But they should not be physical. And the father, it's hard to have a warm relationship with a child when you use physical punishment. And I know that in a lot of communities, physical punishment is a very frequent thing. It's not good for children.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Haskins. Dr. Gadsden, thoughts on that question about assets?
In addition to the points that both the two Rons made, I would just say that to me the most salient asset is the father's presence, not only in relationship to his child, but his presence in the community and with community and engagement with community resources. Moving him from a state of invisibility very often, as I said earlier, facelessness in these communities, to one of visibility. That means that not only his biological child is supported, he kind of represents a father for many other children. I think another asset is kind of utilizing the knowledge that the fathers bring. They know things that they can contribute to both their children and to others. They have the asset and the desire to nurture. There was a lot of talk in Kathy's book about generativity, which is something that many people my age and older are going through or have gone through. And yet these sometimes relatively young fathers in Kathy and Tim's book were talking in generative terms. And then I think one of the strongest assets that they bring, if we can actually focus in on it, is a desire to learn and to become better people and become better parents. How one does that it is a different story. Hazel Marcus has done this framework called Possible Selves. So there's a way in which I take from the book that these fathers have an image of someone they would like to become. So the question is, what is the pathway to get them to that point? And how can both policies as well as programs, for that matter, as well as us as human beings, citizens, make a meaningful contribution to those pathways.
Excellent, excellent. So we had another question, but I want to jump to, I think, what is the more important question before because I had a previous question that I think we may not have time for, and I think the question I'm about to ask is the most important question that I'd like the panelists to respond to, given the time constraint, and that it seems that we've reached this impasse in this crossroads, and Kathy, as well as the panelists, have kind of identified this crossroad in the context of practice and policy. And that in large measure we focus primarily on work, child support, and even issues around the former incarceration status or barriers to work and self-sufficiency of low-income urban fathers. The question that I have, and I think which would be interesting, an opportunity for the audience to weigh in on as we kind of get to that after you guys respond. What are there new areas of consideration that we should pursue that would define kind of a new paradigm or new shift in practice and policy, as well as support that support opportunities for fathers to grow, the impact that they have on the well-being of their children? Are there new things that we as a responsible fatherhood field, as we as an American society should be focused on as particular to these low-income urban fathers, and what should that shift look like? Any of the panels can start. Maybe I'll start with you, Vivian.
I don't think
Okay.
I don't think there's been a shift, but I think that there is a clear message from research, which is that fathers are really important. And as Kathy points out in her book, and many of the panelists have mentioned, fathers in the old days used to be almost an afterthought. And even in the anthropological literature, their fathers are pretty much an afterthought in terms of their parents, in terms of their parenting. And that is just not true. Fathers are crucial. It's very difficult to raise kids who do well as adults without their fathers. So I think that's a wonderful message for fatherhood groups to know, for church groups and others, about how crucial it is to bring the fathers in and to try to help the fathers fulfill their role and their responsibility as fathers.
Great. Are there any, and Vivi, maybe you might also comment on this idea about, what a paradigm shift might look like in practice and policy.
So I think that one thing that I would like to see, and I don't know how directly it will relate to practice and policy, but I think more examination of the ways in which men are situated within communities and neighborhoods. There has been neighborhood research which hasn't really yielded as much definitive data as people would like around the effects of neighborhoods. But really kind of figuring out what the resources are in addition to the fathering programs within these communities. And when I say resources, I don't simply mean, a church, even though a church is important, but also schools and businesses, recreation centers, universities and colleges, hospitals. What investment could they make in these communities, and how could they also really contribute to a way of supporting fathers and have fathers' efforts really be integrated? There's a Responsible Fatherhood Research Network that Temple University was just awarded in collaboration with the Center for Policy Research and NCOC. And I am so optimistic about the ways in which, through that work, we can build practice to be able to both deepen the work that, programs to deepen the work that they already do, but also be more attendant to these more complex issues that truly often go beyond the capacity of a single program to address.
Excellent, excellent. Dr. Mincy, I'm sure you have some thoughts about this idea of paradigm shift, change in practice and policy that we might consider and pursue. Dr. Mincy?
I'm sorry, I muted my phone. What I would like us to focus more on is how do we maximize the value of fathers for their children when they are with their children. So in other words, instead of looking at the downside, let's look at the upside. So I have some recent results from the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Survey that shows that when fathers are engaged, when the lower income fathers that have been the main part of this conversation are engaged with their children, they reduce their behavioral problems and increase their academic achievement, irrespective of whether they live with the child. And what we know from these data is that during the first 4 years of these children's lives, these fathers are actually spending quite a bit of time, non-resident fathers, unmarried fathers, quite a bit of time with their children, and over time, as their relationships with the mother deteriorates, they lose contact with their kids. But during those early years, particularly through the 4th grade, it's very, very important for the intensity of the parenting that children are receiving, whether their parents are reading to them, whether they are playing with them, whether they are teaching them how to building their vocabulary and the like. There's plenty of research that documents that the engagement of fathers with their children, and my recent results, whether they live with their kids or not, has important impacts on children's behavior and on their academic achievement. However, there are a lot of fathers who spend time with their children and they don't know how to maximize the contributions that time makes for children's academic achievement. And therefore, I think what programs ought to be doing is trying to show fathers that when they read to their kids, for example, they should be reading to them in a way that enables the children to react to the stories that they're hearing. Even when they tell stories to their children, that they should be engaging. There's a way to read to children that improves their cognitive ability. And therefore, let's just focus on the upside, particularly over those early years when even unmarried non-resident fathers are spending a lot of time with their kids, so that when their children transition from the 3rd to the 4th grade, where we have a lot of drop-off in their academic performance, those outcomes could be better.
Excellent. Well, I think, thank you. First of all, I want to thank the respondent panelists, and they will have an opportunity to wrap up and have some additional thoughts and comments and after the question and answer period, which is what we're moving into now. And my colleague, Joe Jones, will be moderating that question and answer period from the audience, and then we'll have an opportunity to reflect on that before we close. So take it away, Joe.
So thank you, Kirk, and thank you, respondent panel. I've got 3 questions that I'm going to ask to individual panelists and Kathy, and it will give each of you an opportunity to respond. Kathy, the first one is to you. After I ask the question, I'm going to go and pose the second question to the other panelists, and then the third question, and come back to you, Kathy, to respond. Can you share with the audience what has been the reaction from public policymakers to the findings and observations in your book relative to how they have thought about supporting or not supporting this area of work, to date? That's to you, Kathy. To Ron Mincy, who, in addition to the many other things you've done professionally, you also served as a senior program officer at the Ford Foundation. What is likely to be philanthropy's response to the issues and the strategies and the suggestions that Kathy has uplifted? And then to Dr. Gadsden, there's a question, and for those on the call who may not know, the National Fatherhood Leaders Group is a very diverse organization, and Dr. Gadsden also served as a member of the board for several years. And the question for you, Dr. Gadsden, what are your feelings about women leaders in the fatherhood field, and what is the greatest impact female leaders have on the field? So going back to you, Kathy.
So when the book first came out in late May, we spent a week in Washington briefing policymakers. It was an incredible experience. And one thing that's really interesting is that this really strikes a chord with so many people, because so many Americans grew up without a dad or had an interruption in their contact with their dad. So Americans bring strong opinions, and these opinions and experiences sometimes make it hard for them to hear about the circumstances of the men that we try to serve. But it is through the stories of these men and their day-to-day lives and their aspirations and dreams, the stories of the intensity of their love and commitment to their children, I think they can break through some of that. Frankly, there's a lot of bias out there, and the bias comes from places of, part of it might be racism, part of it might be classism, but a lot of it is personal pain. And I think stories have much more power than numbers to sort of break through and help policymakers who may not be so positive about helping dads warm to the topic. So the stories have been really powerful. Every time we speak, people say, how did you get the guys to say these things? These are such remarkable things that these men say, and we can't take credit for that. We just point to the fathers themselves. So I think people are eager to learn. They're maybe a little hesitant to jump in. There are these biases. There is this kind of prevailing view that these men aren't worth very much. But we're going to keep knocking on doors until we break that down.
Thank you. And Ron Mincy, before you respond, Ron Haskin, I have a question I want to lay with you to think about and to respond to after Vivian answers or gives her answer to the question I posed. And Ron Haskin, the question to you is, why is the non-custodial parent, which is usually the father, solely responsible for the state welfare cash benefit that the custodial parent receives, in quotation, TANF? I have been told that this is a federal requirement, but why isn't the mother responsible for her proportionate share? So Ron Mincy, I'm coming back to you in terms of your thoughts about how philanthropy may react to the observations and suggestions in Kathy's book.
Dr. Mincy?
Oh, I thought you wanted to hear from Ron Haskins first.
No, nope, from you.
Okay,
and
okay.
then,
Okay, I'm sorry. I think that basically, I don't think at this juncture the fatherhood issue is a high priority issue in private philanthropy. There are some foundations that are focused on the issue, and I would, include the Open Society Foundation in particular. But in general, priorities in foundations change. And I think there are some other, issues that are floating to the top of the, top of the agenda in the United States that will capture the attention of private philanthropy. And I just don't think this is one of them. And as good as important as Kathy's book is, I don't think it's going to change that. I think, for example, that we are going to zero in and really do healthcare reform over the next, 5 to 10 years, particularly the states that are not changing their Medicaid programs in response to healthcare reform. And I think that private philanthropy, for example, is going to really, really focus on the implementation of healthcare reform, and it will supersede this. However, I would also say that the moving ahead in healthcare reform will have a lot to do with the population that we're talking about, because a primary group that is uncovered and whose health needs to be attended to is the very men that we're talking about. So I think the priorities are elsewhere, but I also see ways in which helping particularly less educated men who tend to make low earnings and have few benefits are unlikely to be covered by their employer's health insurance. Attending to their health is going to be critical. I think the last thing I'd like to say really quickly is, even to the fathers themselves, I think what a lot of men who have non-resident children have to understand is that their kids will not always be 3 years old. At some point they will be 13, at some point they will be 30. And if they're unable to have the connection to those children when the children are 3, just wait a minute, because those children will need them as they mature. They will look for them when they mature, and the fathers have to keep themselves in the game by writing letters to their children, even if their children never receive the letters, so that when that outreach comes, the father will have the information to say to the child, I always wanted to be connected to you, and I couldn't do it when you were 3. Let's talk when you're 13. I couldn't do it when it was 3. I can do it when you're 30. And those fathers need to understand that and hold on to that hope.
Right. Thank you. Dr. Gazda?
Sure. I just want to reinforce what Ron just said. I think that's very, very important. I think the question had to do with what is the role of women leaders and the greatest impact, right? So I would say that first, the issues of fathers and responsible fatherhood are really the issues of children and families. They're the issues of society. They're the issues of communities and neighborhoods and of human interaction. And so women have a role to play in advancing, and promoting the well-being of those around them. I think to make this an issue, a singular male issue would be a disservice. I think to knowledge building would be a disservice to community building, and it would be a disservice to society building. I think there are several groups that have had an impact. If I just think of the number of researchers who have focused on this, I've just listened to Kathy, who is making a huge impact in our field. But the number of researchers, women researchers who have focused on these issues have come from a range of places. Many of them, like Kathy actually, started off focused on mothers, right? But they may have started looking at young children. For instance, many of the people who do work in Head Start and early Head Start, both the practitioners and the researchers, have used that as a point of departure to think more broadly about how many of the women researchers in those fields have actually come forward and have been among the most prolific researchers focused on fathers as well. And then there are a couple of groups. I think the Women in Fatherhood group, as well as several others who have really taken on a very prominent stance and stand in the field. And I think that in both ways that are not necessarily high visibility and in high visibility ways, they are really extending and expanding the discourse in this field and really contributing to new ways of looking at these issues. Women bring a certain perspective, and it's not a single perspective for all women. And so as human beings and as people who have a range of experiences in the world, they have that to offer. And when it can be complementary to men who are leaders in the fatherhood field, then we have a rich and better field.
And Ron Haskins, before you respond to your question, I want to put another question out for the full panel to consider responding to after Ron Haskins responds to the question posed to him. And this question is, how do, and I think this, to some degree, this speaks to something, Kathy, that you said in your open comments. To some degree, we suffer from a failure of imagination. And the question is, how do you change the mindset of women as well as men who oftentimes write policy with regards to maternal and child health? Paternal and child health and education are left out, minimizing the importance of fathers in pregnancy, birthing, and parenting. So Ron Haskins, to your question.
All right, let me make two points. The first one is that the concept of child support enforcement is that the public, the taxpayers, should not be responsible for raising children and paying for their keep. And so the child support system, which was really pretty ineffective until roughly the 1980s, and has gotten more and more and more effective in the sense of more power, more ability to seize money from bank accounts, to put fathers in jail, to do all kinds of things. It's aggressive with middle-class fathers and low-income fathers both. So the idea is to get money back because taxpayers should not have to pay for children. So you can think of child support payments in two parts. The first part is when you get a divorce or when you have a non-marital birth and the courts become involved, they set a child support amount, and that's what the father's supposed to pay. Let's say $300 a month. But if the father does not pay, then that's when the taxpayers step in, and then that amount of money is supposed to be repaid. That is the concept of child support. There have been a lot of movement in the last, I'd say, 15 years to try to get the money that the fathers pay on those arrearages and pay back to taxpayers, to give that money to mother to raise the child. And there's been some progress on that. Some states sacrifice money so the mother can get more of the child support payment, and the fathers seem to like that. They'd much rather the money go to the mother than to repay taxpayers. Now, as for the question about why the mother doesn't have to pay any money, the answer is that it costs a lot of money to raise children. We have a lot of research on this, and mothers do wind up paying most of the bills. By virtue of the fact that the child lives with the mother pays a lot of money for the child's expenses. And when the father doesn't pay, the mother has to pay. So the concept is that the mother pays directly, pays all kinds of fees, housing, and so forth. And again, as I say, we have many studies that show this. So the father is only paying a certain amount. and the father should be responsible if he hasn't paid that amount to pay back taxpayers. So that's the concept of it.
Thank you, Ron. And then does anybody want to respond to the question that I put out before Ron Haskins was able to respond to his question?
Yeah, let me say something real quickly about it, Joe. This is Haskins again. I think we've come a long ways. I worked in the Congress for many years. I worked in the White House for a year, and I often keep in touch with the people that are doing this, and I'm really amazed by, over the last 30 years, the extent to which people seem to appreciate that children have both a mother and a father. And we see it throughout our society. Fathers are much more committed to household tasks, much more committed to child rearing, much more committed to spending time with their children. We have good evidence on all this. So there's already been a change out there in the countryside. Now, I think the one area where we might change later, I don't know exactly what is meant by mental and child health, but the area that we have the weakest approach, I think, is in visitation and custody. And I think that's an area we need to work on. We should not have the federal government deal with this. We should have the states and localities deal with this, and the courts should be much more vigilant about fathers having the right to visit their children, and that should be enforced. And if the mothers cause trouble, the gatekeeping, as Kathy referred to it, the judge should say to her directly, this is a big issue in custody. I want the parent that is going to facilitate a relationship between the child and both parents is the one that should have the custody, because they're the one with the interests of the child at heart. The courts haven't done that. They have in some places in the country, but I think that possibly could be a wave in the future.
So I'll just jump in it too. I think in addition to what Ron said, we really need to send a message to single moms that dads are important. You would think that that would be one audience we wouldn't have to convince because they're with their children every day. But I think they, I spent my entire early career studying single moms and have tremendous respect for them, but there is a view that I can do it on my own and I don't really need a father around. I'm kind of sufficient as a parent. Or I can swap daddies and I can bring my new partner in, he can play the father role. So I do think we need to really work harder to convince mothers of the importance of father's role and give mothers some of the messages of the research that the Rons have been sharing with us today.
Great, thank you. So final question for this segment before I transition back to Kirk, and this is to you, Ron Mincy. And I don't know if this is a friend or nemesis, but they specifically targeted this question to you. And it says, although this is a widespread phenomenon crossing racial and cultural spectrums, why is it that children of color who come from fatherless homes end up in foster care, and foster care is made up primarily of African American and Latino children? There is still a disparity between children of color and white children as it relates to fatherlessness and foster care.
Well, I think the simple answer to that question is that the rates of non-marital births among African Americans are at 70%, and the rates of non-marital births among whites are in the 40% range. And therefore, the likelihood that when the mother becomes unavailable, incapacitated, that there is a paternal line to turn to, either the father himself or the father's in-laws or the father's relatives, the likelihood that a black child has the paternal line as a alternative to foster care is still much, much less. So I think that's the reason. But I think what's the family formation patterns of African Americans have been a harbinger of things to come. And what we see is, though African Americans have non-marital birth rates up at the 70% level, the rates among whites are rising, and they're rising really fast. And so, I hate to say this, but I think we've been ignoring these challenges associated with family functioning for decades because they primarily occurred to children of color. And I think now that many white children are experiencing these, not as a consequence of divorce, but as a consequence of non-marital birth, we are going to pay much more attention to them. And the last 15 years of my career have borne that out. I mean, we've been, and that's one of the reasons why I really think it's important for us to understand, not paint this problem as primarily an issue of Black and Latinos, but to understand that it crosses racial lines and it has adverse implications for all children who are born in this context.
I want to
Joe,
thank
can I add
the...
something real quickly, Joe?
Yep.
Joe, let me
Okay.
add something real quickly, and that is that this situation is definitely changing. The number of kids in foster care is going down. Local child welfare programs are doing everything they can to place the children with relatives, and especially with the father, if possible, or the father's relatives. And there's been somewhat successful because the numbers are actually, the number of kids in foster care is declining.
Thank you, Ron. So I really want to thank the audience for submitting their questions, and I apologize to those of you whose questions we couldn't get to. We tried to let themes emerge, and some of your questions merged into others, and so we answered them that way. But we will continue to try to filter your questions and answer them on the NFLG website, again at nflgonline.org. I'm now going to turn the segment over to Kirk for wrap-up.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, and I really appreciate the audience providing those really important questions. And so I think what we know, there's a couple of themes that are emerging, that fatherhood strikes a chord with most of us, right, as Americans. That fathers, there's this emerging idea that fathers have an asset to give to their children and potentially in support of the mother in functioning in her role, and that fathers want to and be fathers, that low-income urban fathers want to be fathers, notwithstanding the complexities of their lives, and that we really need to think about, and mothers need to think about how they can embrace that reality in its totality. But what I wanted to do is give the panelists the opportunity to, and I know this is often a challenge, to give one key takeaway that you might want to put forward as to the audience, and just kind of emerging from this overall discourse. One key takeaway you'd like us, that you might share with us and like us to have before we bring this to closure. So maybe we can start with Vivian, and then we can go to Dr. Mency and then Dr. Haskins.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to go first.
Thank you, Dr.
I guess.
Because Dr. Gasson, because you can handle it. That's why.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I think there are so many issues in this book, and I think that the significance of desire and that the fathers whom Kathy studies and whom many of us know, that's attached to a kind of hopefulness that they place in their children for the next generation should be something we should consider. That would mean that we would really have to think more strategically about how we support fathers across ethnic groups, and certainly low-income fathers in low-income homes and communities, to make the kind of contributions that they want to be able to make to their children's emotional and cognitive development, and some support for doing that. And one venue would be by looking more strategically and carefully within communities and neighborhoods.
Okay, great. Dr. Haskins?
I think the main thing there are two things that I would emphasize. One is that the research shows now so clearly, it's building up year after year after year. This has been the case for at least 15 years, that fathers are really important to children's development, and that kids that grow up without their fathers and without their father's constant relationship with the child and the father, that those kids are at a very serious disadvantage. They do worse in school, they're more likely to drop out, they're more likely to get in trouble, they're more likely to be in juvenile justice system, they're more likely themselves to have a baby outside marriage even as a teenager. So there are lots of impacts, and that's the first thing the fathers should know, that their instinct about how important their father role is exactly right and borne out in the numbers. In this regard, some people in the audience might want to read a recent paper called Wayward Sons. If you Google Wayward Sons, it'll come right up. And then the second thing, of course, is the message that I tried to give the first time around, which is that it's very difficult for the father to stay involved in the child's life if the child is not with the mother. And I think both the fathers and the mothers and the fatherhood movement should be deeply committed to trying to do everything possible to keep these young couples together and to help them make a go of it. There's some encouragement from the Oklahoma program that I mentioned before. I think we can learn a lot more. If these couples stay together, it will be better for them, it will be better for the child, and it will be better for their communities.
Dr. Mincy, your closing takeaway? Dr. Mincy?
Sorry, I said my closing takeaway really rifles back to a point that Kathy made at the close of her conversation that has to do with, you know, where do we go in terms of policy? I think when President Obama took office, before he took office, Senator Obama had a proposal to expand the earned income tax credit, which is now the biggest anti-poverty program we have in the United States. And it touches not only the poor, but people who are sort of located and make around $30,000 to $40,000 a year. As I mentioned, there are a lot of non-resident fathers who have income up at that level, and we really need to expand, subsidize the earnings of low-income men, particularly those who are non-resident fathers, so that they will have the capacity to contribute to their children financially, which will encourage them to contribute to their children otherwise.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Edin, of course, we cannot end this without you giving us your critical takeaway, given all your great work and the insights you've shared with us today.
So January 8th marks the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty. And the War on Poverty was primarily about women, children, and the elderly. 50 years later, we have an opportunity as a movement to launch a new war on poverty for men. Nothing we've talked about today is possible without the solid foundation of a job. And the men we're talking about, men in the bottom 2/5 of the income distribution, are bleeding economically. And so talking about fatherhood is critical, but we have to, at the same time, launch a war on poverty that incorporates men, that lifts them up, and that recognizes the vital need for the basic, to have a job and to be able to make a living.
And I will pass it back to NFLG Chair for closure.
Listen, to our national audience, we owe you a deep, sense of gratitude for spending time, taking time out of your day to spend an hour and a half with us, with our stellar keynote presenter and respondent panelists. We've had over 1,000 people register for this webinar. Just a fantastic response. Kathy, if I could, I would send you a hug, so I'm going to send you a virtual one, and to you, Dr. Gaston, a virtual hug as well. To the Rons on the call, where you're not getting a hug, you're going to get a handshake.
You better not send us any hugs.
But we want to, again, give our sincere thanks and appreciation to the Open Society Foundation's campaign for Black Male Achievement for funding support, allowing us to execute our national work, which includes today's webinar, and again, offer our deep sense of gratitude and appreciation to Root Cause and the Institute for Black Male Achievement Network for their help and technical support with this webinar, which could not have been done without you. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to follow-up work. And please visit nflgonline.org to see how you can join and become a member. Thank you, and good luck.
Thank you.